The blood had already soaked through the bandage by the time the helicopter appeared on the horizon. Maya Calloway did not look up. Her left hand was wrapped in field dressing she had applied to herself 40 minutes earlier in between treating other people's wounds. The blood seeping through the linen was hers. She knew the anatomy well enough to know it wasn't going to kill her. She also knew it was going to change things permanently, but that was a problem for later. Right now, there was a man with a femoral bleed who needed her left hand to keep cranking the windlass on his tourniquet, regardless of what was happening inside that hand, and there was a rifle on her right shoulder, and somewhere out on the eastern ridge of Raven Canyon, at a distance that most trained military snipers would not attempt, under ideal conditions, there was a man who had been trying to put a round through Master Sergeant Aldous Holt's skull for the past 4 minutes. Holt didn't know. That was the part that would stay with Maya longer than the pain in her hand, longer than the sound the rifle made when she fired it, longer than the silence that fell over the canyon when the target dropped. The man she saved never knew he needed saving. She cranked the tourniquet one more time. The bleeding slowed, stopped. She lowered the rifle. Her left hand began to tremble. For the first time all day, something in Maya Calloway's body admitted that it had been afraid. This is not the story of how she learned to shoot. That story began 18 years earlier on a cold October morning in Montana when her father set a bolt-action rifle in her hands for the first time and told her to stop thinking about the target and start thinking about the wind. This is the story of why she stopped and what it cost her to start again. 48 hours before the ambush, FOB Desert Hawk smelled like motor oil canvas and the particular kind of heat that settles into the bones of the American Southwest and refuses to leave. Cochise County, Arizona, 53 miles from the Mexican border, the kind of country where the land itself seems indifferent to whether you live or die. The forward operating base had been established 18 months earlier in response to escalating cartel activity along a corridor the DIEA called the Sonora Passage. It was not a glamorous posting. There were no distinguished visitors, no congressional delegations, no journalists. There was dust and heat and the low-frequency tension of a mission that never quite became a battle and never quite became peace. Recon Team Razor 6 had been stationed there for 11 weeks. They were Marine Corps, 14 men trained for reconnaissance and direct action in austere environments. Their average age was 29. Their average deployment count was 3. They were, by any reasonable measure, a capable and experienced unit. What they were not was prepared for the person who walked into their medical tent on the morning of the 23rd. Maya Calloway was 28 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 118 pounds. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it made her look younger than she was, which was already young enough that several members of Razor 6 had, upon first seeing her, assumed she was an administrative aide who had wandered into the wrong part of the base. She was not an administrative aide. The Navy Corpsman insignia on her collar said HM2, Hospital Corpsman Second Class, a Fleet Marine Force designation that meant she had been specifically trained and specifically assigned to war work alongside Marine units in the field. She had completed combat casualty care certification. She had scored in the top 4% of her corpsman class on trauma assessment. She had 3 years of service in the United States Navy and a file that said in the careful language of official documentation that she was a competent and reliable medical asset. What her file did not say was everything else. On the morning of the 23rd, Maya was organizing her medical supplies with the kind of precision that went beyond professional habit. Tourniquets arranged by size, not by the order they had been unpacked. Combat gauze organized by expiration date earliest in front. Morphine auto-injectors counted and recounted, each one sitting in its designated space like a soldier at attention. Her hands moved through this process with the efficiency of someone performing a task that required no conscious thought, which meant her mind was elsewhere. Through the thin walls of the medical tent, she could hear the team outside preparing for the convoy. The voices carried. She had learned in 3 years of service that the voices always carried. The convoy had been scheduled for 2 days. A humanitarian supply run to a border monitoring station 80 miles south through terrain that the base commander had rated as moderate risk. Food, medical supplies, communications equipment. Straightforward in theory. In practice, the route passed through Raven Canyon, a natural corridor between high rock walls that the DEA had flagged 3 times in the previous year as a potential interdiction point. Razor 6 had done the route twice before without incident. The 3rd time is where the stories come from. Maya finished arranging the combat gauze. She straightened a tourniquet that was already straight. Then she heard Corporal Garrett Mercer's voice through the wall, easy and carrying the voice of a man who had never once in his 26 years lacked for confidence. "Command sending the doc with us." A pause. Someone else's voice lower, not quite audible. Mercer again. "Yeah, I know. Humanitarian run to the border station." On another pause, and then with the casual certainty of a man stating an obvious fact rather than offering an opinion, "She's going to slow us down, probably fold the first time we take contact." Maya did not stop moving. She had heard variations of this conversation on every deployment, in every unit, in every FOB, and forward position she had ever been assigned to. The specific words changed. The underlying logic did not. She was small, she was a woman, she had never been outside the wire. These were facts. She could not argue with facts. What she could do was her job. She finished organizing the morphine auto-injectors. Then she pulled her left sleeve down over her wrist, covering the thin white scar on her forearm that had been there long enough to fade but not long enough to disappear. She had stopped noticing it consciously years ago. The gesture was automatic. Master Sergeant Aldous Holt entered the medical tent without knocking. He was 48 years old, 6'1", with the kind of face that had been weathered by 30 years of Marine Corps service into something that was no longer exactly handsome but was deeply specifically authoritative. His uniform was pressed with creases that belonged to a man who had worn it so long that the act of maintaining it had become inseparable from his sense of self. He looked at Maya. She looked back. "You volunteered for the convoy," he said. "Yes, Master Sergeant." "Why?" Well, it was not phrased as a question. Holt had the habit common among long-serving NCOs of treating questions as statements and watching to see what the other person did with the ambiguity. "The border station has no dedicated medical," Maya said. "If something happens to one of your Marines out there and there's no one to treat them, that's a problem I can prevent." Holt studied her for a moment. "You've never been outside the wire." "No, Master Sergeant. Training is an experience. I lost a medic once, Afghanistan 2008. Good kid, frozen a firefight. Cost us 2 Marines while he was standing there trying to remember what he was supposed to do." He paused. "You freeze on me, you're a liability, not an asset." "I won't freeze." Holt's jaw shifted slightly. The expression on his face did not change, but something in his eyes did some small recalibration of assessment. He had heard those words before. He had heard them from men who meant them and from men who only thought they meant them. And experience had taught him that there was no reliable way to tell the difference until the moment of truth arrived. "Wheels up at 0600, he said. "Bring your best game, because if you can't keep up, I'm leaving you in the truck." He left. Maya returned to her supplies. Her hands were perfectly steady. The motor pool at 0550 was noise and movement, and the particular organized chaos of a unit preparing to go somewhere dangerous. 3 Humvees in convoy formation. 14 Marines in full kit weapons, ready, the kind of focused energy that comes from training and experience, and the knowledge that everything you are about to do matters. Maya loaded her medical bag into the second vehicle. 35 pounds of equipment, trauma kits, hemostatic agents, surgical airways, IV supplies enough to handle mass casualty events in the first critical hour. She lifted it into the truck bed the way she always lifted it, distributing the weight efficiently, no wasted motion. Chief Warrant Officer Brennan Cole noticed. Cole was 52 years old. 28 years in the United States Navy, the last 15 of them as a SEAL sniper, before a combination of age, arthritis, and an operational injury to his left knee had moved him into a recon support role. He was stationed at Desert Hawk as a senior advisor, which in practice meant that Razor 6 benefited from his knowledge of terrain analysis and precision shooting without technically requiring him to do either. He was standing beside the third Humvee when Maya loaded her bag. He was watching the motor pool with the habitual low-intensity alertness of someone who had spent 15 years being paid to notice things other people missed. He noticed 3 things about Maya Calloway in the 4 minutes she spent preparing her vehicle. The first was the bag. 35 pounds is not a trivial weight. The way most people of Maya's size would lift it involved visible effort, a momentary shift of balance, some adjustment of posture. Maya lifted it the way an experienced operator lifts a weapon, weight-centered, motion-efficient. No part of the movement giving away information about the effort involved. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that most people would never notice. Cole noticed. The second thing was the way she scanned the motor pool before she stepped into it. Not a casual glance. A systematic sweep moving in a specific pattern, right to left across the near perimeter before shifting to the far perimeter. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. It was the kind of scan you performed when you wanted to know your exits and your angles before you committed to a position. It was not standard practice for a medical officer preparing a vehicle for a convoy. Cole noticed that too. The third thing happened when Maya walked past the weapons rack on the outside wall of the equipment shed. Her right hand moved to her side where a rifle would have been slung if she'd been carrying one. A single-touch automatic unconscious. Her fingers closed on nothing. She registered the absence and kept walking without breaking stride. Muscle memory, the kind that gets drilled into you so deeply that it operates below conscious awareness. The kind that does not go away in 3 years or 5 years or 10. Cole said nothing. He watched her climb into the second Humvee and did not take his eyes off the door of that vehicle for a long moment after it closed. PFC Connor Hayes stumbled while doing his final equipment check. He caught himself on the Humvee's front bumper, blinked hard, and straightened up with the careful, deliberate movement of someone working against a body that is not cooperating. Maya was across the motor pool in 8 steps. She did not run. She moved with the same fluid efficiency she had used loading the medical bag, direct and unhurried, as if she had been tracking Hayes since before he stumbled and had simply been waiting for the confirmation. Hayes, her voice was calm and specific. How much water have you had this morning? The private was 22 years old with the kind of open, earnest face that belongs to people who have not yet learned to hide what they are thinking. A canteen, he said. Maybe a canteen and a half. How do you feel? Fine, ma'am. Little tired. Dizzy, a beat. Yeah, little bit. Nauseous, another pause longer. Maybe. Maya put 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Pulse. Then the back of her hand to his forehead and cheek. Temperature. She looked at his eyes, noted the pupil dilation despite the shade. She looked at his hands, noted the tremor that Hayes himself probably hadn't registered yet. She had been standing next to him for 45 seconds. Master Sergeant, she did not raise her voice. It carried anyway. I need to run blood work on Hayes before deployment. From 30 feet away, Mercer made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Jesus, Doc, it's barely 0600. The kid's fine. He's been loading gear and body armor for 2 hours. It's hot. Maya did not look at Mercer. She kept her eyes on Holt. Early stage heat exhaustion possibly progressing. Skin pallor, tremor in the extremities. Pupillary response inconsistent with current light conditions. I need 15 minutes in a field test kit. Holt's expression did not change. Around him, the team waited with the specific patience of people who have learned to stand still while other people make decisions. We're on a schedule, Corpsman. Master Sergeant. Maya met his eyes, steady. If I'm wrong, leave me on base. But if I'm right and he deploys, he collapses before we reach the canyon. Best case, that's a medical evacuation that blows your timeline. Worst case, it's a cardiac event in the middle of a contact. Mercer shook his head. This is a let her check. Cole's voice from beside the third vehicle. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 words in a tone that did not invite argument. Holt looked at his CWO for a moment, then back at Maya. 15 minutes. Clock is running. The field test results took 11 minutes. Sodium 128 milliequivalents per liter. Normal range begins at 135. Potassium 2.9 milliequivalents per liter. Normal range begins at 3.5. Severe bilateral electrolyte depletion, the kind that shuts down the electrical signaling and cardiac muscle, the kind that can cause arrhythmia and seizure and death in young men who look perfectly healthy until they don't. Maya showed Holt the numbers. He studied them for a moment without speaking. Outside, the convoy was ready, engines running. The desert was already climbing toward 90 degrees, and it was not yet 6 in the morning. 12 hours from now, Maya said. His sodium drops another 5 points. He loses consciousness, maybe seizes, possibly worse. Holt handed the kit back. Hayes stays. Corpsman deploys. He turned to Mercer, who was standing nearby with an expression that had shifted somewhere between surprise and recalibration. You got a problem with that, Corporal? Mercer said nothing. As Maya walked back to the second Humvee, she passed Cole. The old chief was leaning against the vehicle with his arms crossed, watching her, with the same quiet evaluating attention he had been giving her since the motor pool. She did not acknowledge him. He did not speak. But his eyes had changed. The evaluation had shifted towards something that did not have a simple name. The convoy rolled out of FOB Desert Hawk at 0617. 3 vehicles, 13 personnel, including Maya. The landscape opened up in every direction. Scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, the earth in shades of red and ochre and bleached tan, the mountains in the distance, shimmering already in the heat. The sky above was the particular hard flat blue of the desert in summer, the kind of sky that offers no shelter and no comfort. Maya rode in the second Humvee. Sergeant Dana Whitmore drove steady and quiet with the unhurried competence of someone who had learned not to waste attention on things that weren't immediately in front of her. Cole rode in the passenger seat. For the first 20 minutes, nobody spoke. Then Whitmore said, without taking her eyes off the terrain, "That call on Hayes, that level of diagnostic work, that's not basic corpsman training." Maya looked out the side window. "I pay attention. That's not what I mean." Whitmore glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Where did you actually train before corpsman school?" "Corpsman school, field medicine certification, that's the pipeline." "No." Whitmore's eyes returned to the road. "What you did back there, the pattern recognition, the speed of assessment, that belongs to someone who spent a long time learning to read people under pressure. That's not something they teach in the standard curriculum." Maya watched the desert pass. "I grew up paying attention." Cole turned his head slightly toward the window on his side. He did not look at Maya. He did not ask a question, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, some small adjustment that might have been thought or recognition or the first stage of understanding. He said nothing. The convoy pushed south. Raven Canyon appeared on the horizon at 10:47 hours, a dark line across the landscape that resolved as they approached into something that looked like the earth had simply cracked open and been left that way. The walls were 60 feet of sedimentary rock, layered in bands of rust and gray, rising on both sides of the only passable route through the area. 20 miles in any direction, there was no other way through. The canyon was half a mile long. The walls were close enough in places that you could have thrown a baseball from one side to the other. Maya straightened in her seat when the canyon came into view. It was a subtle change. Nothing in her expression moved, but something in her posture shifted, the kind of shift that happens when a person moves from passive attention to active analysis. Her eyes began to move in a pattern, left wall to right wall, near approaches to far rim, the kind of systematic terrain assessment that had a name in the field and was not taught in any medical curriculum. Her lips moved. "Classic L-shaped kill zone." The words were almost inaudible, barely a breath. The kind of thing a person says when they are thinking out loud without intending to be heard, when the thought is so automatic that the distinction between thinking and speaking dissolves. Cole heard it. He turned from the window, looked at her directly for the first time in the drive. His expression was still careful, the face of a man who has been trained to observe without reacting, to receive information, without broadcasting that he has received it. "What did you say?" Maya blinked. A small, specific blink, the kind that accompanies a return to awareness from a place the conscious mind had not intended to go. She looked at Cole. "Nothing, Chief. Just a beat. Just observing the terrain." "You said L-shaped kill zone." His voice was level. "That's not a phrase that appears in any medical training document I've ever seen." "I read," Maya said. Cole studied her face for 3 seconds. Something was moving behind his eyes, something that was assembling itself from small pieces, the way she lifted the bag, the way she scanned the motor pool, the way her hand had reached for a rifle that wasn't there, and now this. A specific tactical phrase delivered with the unconscious fluency of long familiarity. He opened his mouth to speak. Holt's voice came over the radio. "All units maintain the spacing through the canyon. Standard interval. Stay alert." The vehicle slowed. 50-meter separation. The walls of Raven Canyon rose on either side as the convoy entered, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shadow, and the wind died, and the desert went completely, absolutely quiet. Maya's hand moved to the door handle. She tested it once, just slightly, confirming it opened freely. The movement was smooth and automatic, and she was not aware she had done it. Cole saw it. He did not speak. The canyon walls closed around them. Too quiet. Maya's head came up, the specific animal alertness of a person whose instincts have registered a threat before the conscious mind has processed the information. She turned to Cole. "Chief," the world came apart. Muzzle flashes erupted from the canyon rim on the left side, a dozen points of light strobing in rapid sequence. Automatic weapons fire, heavy caliber stitching across the dirt in front of the lead vehicle. The windshield of Humvee 1 went white and then collapsed inward. Rounds spanged off armor plating with sounds like thrown hammers. Contact left." Holt's voice, raw and immediate, cutting through the chaos with the authority of 3 decades. "All units dismount, find cover." The convoy stopped. Doors opened. Marines moved. Maya was already out of the vehicle before the command finished, rolling low on the door, medical bag in her left hand, 3-point scan of the immediate environment completed before her boots were fully on the ground. She had been told countless times in the last 3 years that her first and only responsibility in a contact situation was to get to cover and stay there until she was needed. She did not get to cover. Lance Corporal Jesse Vance was on the ground 20 feet away, screaming, both hands pressed to his right shoulder, where the blood was pulsing through his fingers in the bright arterial red that has a specific meaning for anyone who has ever seen it. Maya moved toward him before the scream fully registered, before the tactical situation was assessed, before anything except the fundamental orientation that had been the entire center of her adult life. She covered 20 feet of open ground, while rounds from the canyon rim kicked up dirt within arm's reach. She did not run straight. She moved in the pattern she had been trained to move, low and angular, never presenting the same target for more than a half second, finding the angles between lines of fire with a precision that looked to anyone watching like something other than accident. Mercer, behind the engine block of the second Humvee, watched her cross that ground. He had been in 3 firefights before this one. He had seen things in those firefights that had changed the way he understood human behavior under pressure. He thought he had a reasonable idea of what people were capable of. He watched the medic cross 20 feet of kill zone in a contact firefight without flinching, and he revised his understanding. Maya reached Vance. Her hands found the wound with no searching, no hesitation. Shoulder entry, lateral deltoid clean through, no obvious arterial involvement from the initial assessment, but heavy venous bleeding that needed pressure now and a proper examination in the next 30 seconds. "You're okay," she said. Her voice had the quality of something structural, something you could put weight on. "You're okay, look at me, breathe." Vance looked at her. His breathing stuttered once, then steadied. She was already packing the wound. One hand maintaining pressure while the other accessed the combat gauze. The whole process unfolding in the kind of controlled sequence that belongs to muscle memory, not real-time decision-making. Doc Mercer's voice from behind the Humvee. "Get down, you're exposed." She did not look up. A round sparked off metal 18 inches from her right shoulder. She did not flinch. "Cover me better, Corporal." 3 words spoken in exactly the tone of voice a surgeon uses when asking for a different instrument. No urgency, no fear, an expectation of compliance. Mercer blinked. He raised his rifle and began laying down suppressive fire toward the canyon rim. Maya finished with Vance and moved to Corporal Marcus Reed, who was flat on his back behind the lead vehicle, the breath gone from him where 2 rounds had impacted his chest plate. The plate had stopped the bullets. His ribs had not. She assessed, stabilized, gave him something for the pain, spoke 3 sentences in the same calm structural voice. Then she moved to the next casualty. She worked through the next 30 minutes the way she organized her medical supplies, systematically, efficiently, in the order that mattered most. 6 casualties across 3 vehicles under continuous fire in 104 degrees of heat. Her triage decisions were flawless. Her technique was flawless. Her hands did not shake. Mercer, watching her work while she wrapped his cracked ribs, said what he had been thinking since the canyon entrance. "Your hands." She looked up. "They're not shaking." He gestured with his eyes, unable to move his arms. "Combat medics always shake, adrenaline, fear. But you're—" He searched for the word. "You're like a surgeon in an operating room. Like you've done this 100 times. Maya looked at her hands. They held a hemostatic bandage, applying even pressure to his ribcage. No tremor, no deviation. Steady as stone. "Training," she said. "What kind of training does that?" She did not answer. Cole had been watching her work from his position behind the 3rd Humvee. Wounded now himself from a round through the left shoulder that had come in while he was trying to locate the enemy sniper on the east ridge. Maya had treated him 12 minutes ago, packed the wound, applied the tourniquet with the efficiency of someone who had applied 100 of them. But even in his current state, even managing pain and blood loss in the operational reality of a firefight that was not going their way, Cole had not stopped watching her. Not the way the others watched her, with surprise or confusion. Cole watched her the way a person watches something they recognize but cannot quite place. The way a former language teacher watches someone speak a language they claim not to know. His M24 rifle was on the ground where he had dropped it after the second shot had torn the stock from his hands. The East Ridge sniper had them pinned. 680 meters elevated position, methodical, impatient, and professional. Their carbines couldn't reach him accurately. Their only precision option was lying in the dirt. Cole looked at the rifle. Then he looked at Maya Calloway, who was finishing Mercer's bandage with a facility that did not belong to her job title. He said her name. She looked up. "Can you shoot?" The canyon walls echoed the ongoing fire. Somewhere behind the second Humvee, a Marine called for more ammunition. The sun was almost directly overhead now, the heat absolute and indifferent. Maya looked at Cole. Then she looked at the rifle in the dirt. She did not answer for 20 seconds. In those 20 seconds, Holt appeared around the front of the second vehicle. He was holding a photograph. Old, worn at the edges, the kind that gets carried in a pocket or a bag for a long time. He had found it in her footlocker while looking for a radio battery, and he had stood looking at it for 30 seconds before he understood what he was looking at. A girl 16 years old, small, dark hair in a ponytail, standing at a shooting range beside a man in marine dress blues, older, the same dark eyes. Between them, the girl held a precision rifle, not a carbine, not a standard-issue weapon, but the kind of long-range competitive equipment that most military snipers never get their hands on. Behind them, the targets at various distances showed groupings so tight they looked like the work of a machine, not a person. Holt turned the photo over. Handwriting faded but legible. Maya and Dad, Montana State Long Range Championship, first place, 1,200 meters, age 16. Holt looked at Maya. He looked at the rifle Cole was pointing to. He looked at the photograph again. He said, "Whose daughter are you?" The canyon wind picked up, heat and dust. In the distance, the East Ridge sniper's rifle cracked again, and the round came close enough to the front wheel of Humvee 1 that the impact rang through the frame of the vehicle like a struck bell. Maya looked at Holt, at the photograph in his hands, at the image of herself at 16 standing next to the man who had spent 8 years teaching her things she had promised never to use again. She said, "He was my father." Holt turned the photograph over, read the name she had not yet spoken. His jaw worked once. He looked at Cole. Something passed between the two older men. Recognition, the weight of a name they both knew. Cole said quietly, "Nathan Calloway was the best rifle instructor I ever trained with. Pendleton, 1989. I never met his daughter." He looked at Maya. "Until now." The photograph stayed in Holt's hand. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that rearranges his understanding of a situation he thought he already understood. The girl in the image was 16 years old. The rifle she was holding cost more than most people's cars. The targets behind her at 1,200 meters showed groups that would have been remarkable from a trained military shooter in optimal conditions. From a 16-year-old girl on a civilian range in Montana, they were something else entirely. Holt turned the photo back over. Read the name again. Nathan Calloway. Gunnery Sergeant Nathan Calloway had been one of the most decorated scout sniper instructors in Marine Corps history. 31 confirmed training graduates who had gone on to serve with distinction in Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other places that never made the news. A man whose name had circulated for 2 decades in the specific way that certain names circulate in military communities, not with fanfare, but with the quiet weight of earned reputation. Holt had trained alongside him for 6 weeks in 1989. He had not known Nathan Calloway well, but he had known him well enough to remember standing in a canyon in Arizona 25 years later, with bullets in the air, exactly what it had meant to watch the man shoot. He looked at Maya. She was looking back at him with an expression that was impossible to read, the expression of someone who has been carrying a secret for so long that the moment of discovery has a quality of relief and grief in equal measure. The East Ridge sniper fired again. The round went through the windshield frame of Humvee 2 6 inches above where Whitmore was crouched, and the sound it made passing through the metal was like a ruled line being drawn across the inside of the skull. Cole said, "We need to talk about the rifle." The East Ridge was a natural firing platform, 60 feet above the canyon floor, accessible by a goat trail on the far side that the convoy had no way to reach. It gave the shooter a downward angle on every vehicle and every piece of cover Razor 6 had managed to find. At 680 meters, it was beyond the effective range of the M4 carbines that made up most of the team's firepower. The rounds they had been sending up the ridge were suppressing nothing. The sniper had read the terrain before setting up, and he knew exactly what reach their weapons had and exactly how much margin he was operating with. He was patient. That was the worst part. He did not hurry. He moved between shots with the deliberate efficiency of someone who understood that time was on his side, that the mathematics of the situation favored waiting over rushing, that each measured shot gave Razor 6 exactly enough to deal with, and no more. Cole had tried twice. The first attempt had been within 5 minutes of taking his wound, which was already a decision that said something about the man. He had packed his own shoulder one-handed, secured the bandaging with his teeth, and his right hand picked up the M24 and tried to establish a position. His left arm would not hold the weight. The shoulder wound had severed something important in the way the joint communicated with the muscles below it, and the rifle barrel moved in small, continuous arcs that no amount of will or experience could correct for. The shot had gone wide by 4 feet. The return fire had been immediate and professional, a single round that had struck the stock of the M24 and spun the weapon out of Cole's hands. The M24 lay on the ground now, the stock cracked, but the action intact, the scope undamaged. It was a serviceable weapon. What it needed was a serviceable shooter. Cole looked at Maya. She was looking at the rifle. 20 seconds passed. The sounds of the canyon filled that silence. The sporadic crack of carbine fire from Razor 6's positions, the deeper, more deliberate report from the ridge above the wind, moving through the rock walls in low tuneless registers. Somewhere on the other side of Humvee, 3 Marcus Reed was breathing in the careful, controlled way of a man managing serious pain with nothing but will. Maya's chest rose and fell. The rhythm changed. It was subtle. Most people would not have noticed it. Cole noticed it because he had spent 15 years training human beings to do one of the most technically demanding things a human body is capable of, and in that time he had learned to recognize the specific shift in respiration that occurred when a trained shooter entered the physiological state that made precision possible. The conscious mind stepping back, the body taking over. 4 counts and hold for 7, 8 counts out, heart rate dropping. The world narrowing to the essential geometry of distance and wind and the space between a finger and a trigger. He had not seen it happen involuntarily before. Maya was not holding a rifle. She was crouched behind a vehicle in the middle of a firefight looking at a weapon on the ground, and her body was already preparing to shoot. She said, "I promised my mother." The words came out quietly without drama. Not an explanation, not a refusal. Something closer to a statement of fact delivered by a person who understands that facts and circumstances do not always resolve in favor of each other. Cole said, "I know." A Marine to the left of Humvee 1 went down. Not a serious wound around through the calf that produced a sharp cry and then a controlled trained silence as the man managed the injury and kept his position. But the team was running out of people who could hold a line, and the sniper on the ridge knew it, and the sound of that knowledge was in every shot he took. Holt moved along the line toward Cole's position, staying low, covering ground in the efficient crouch of a man who has done it thousands of times. He looked at Maya. He looked at the rifle. He said nothing. Maya looked at the photograph still in Holt's hand. The girl with the rifle, her father in his dress blues. The targets behind them had said in the objective language of tight groups at extreme distance exactly what 8 years of training under one of the best instructors the Marine Corps had ever produced was capable of producing. She picked up the M24. The weight settled into her hands the way the weight of something familiar settles, not consciously recognized, but physically understood by the body before the mind has a chance to form an opinion. 43 inches, 11 pounds. The balance point sitting precisely where her muscle memory said it would be, in the space between the front of the magazine well and the end of the stock. She had not held this specific weapon before. She had held its predecessor, its cousins, its training equivalents, had held them for 8 years before she had held nothing for 8 years, and the body does not entirely forget what the mind decides to abandon. She moved to a position behind the front wheel of Humvee 2, kneeling. Left elbow on the hood's edge for support, cheek finding the stock, eye aligning with the scope. The adjustment took less than 2 seconds. The scope picture came clear. East Ridge, Emerridge, 680 meters. Elevated target partially concealed behind a rock formation that gave him cover from the front, but left his right side exposed in a narrow window when he shifted to acquire new targets. She had been watching the pattern of his movement for the last 20 minutes, while treating casualties, storing the data without knowing she was storing it the way she had been trained to observe and calculate and retain long before she had understood what observation and calculation were actually for. She found the window. She watched him shift. The window opened. She let it close. The first shot went high and right by approximately 3 feet. Mercer exhaled sharply from behind the engine block. "She can't." Cole cut him off with a look that had no words in it and did not need any. Maya had not moved, had not flinched, had not changed anything in her expression or her posture. The miss was information, not failure. It told her the rifle was pulling 3 inches right at this distance, which combined with the uphill angle and the wind running left to right across the canyon floor meant she needed 1 click of left windage and 2 clicks down on the elevation turret. She worked the bolt. The spent casing ejected in a bright arc. She made the adjustments, settled back into position, found the window again. The target shifted right to acquire the vehicle at the front of the convoy. The window opened. She squeezed, not pulled the trigger. The rifle reported. The sound rolled off the canyon walls and back again. 680 meters up the ridge, the enemy sniper stopped moving in the specific way that means a thing is finished. He dropped without drama, without the theatrical fall of the movies, simply folded, and was still. The firing from the ridge stopped. For a moment, the canyon was quiet in a way it had not been quiet since before the first shot. Maya lowered the rifle, worked the bolt, left the action open. She set the weapon down and moved to check Reed's vital signs, because that was what needed to happen next, and she knew what needed to happen next, and the transition required no internal negotiation. There would be time for the other things later. There was always time for things later that there was no time for now. Mercer watched her move to Reed. He did not say anything. But something in his face had changed in the space between the shot and this moment. Some layer of certainty removed, leaving something underneath that was less certain and more honest. The dust cloud appeared to the south 17 minutes later. Whitmore spotted it first from the lead vehicle, a rising column of pale earth moving at speed along the approach road, resolving as it drew closer into 5 vehicles. Then 6, the lead truck running fast with what appeared to be a heavy weapon mounted in the bed. Behind it, 4 pickup trucks in a staggered formation that was not random, was not careless, was the specific tactical arrangement of people who had been trained to move in this way and had done it enough times to do it without thinking. 30 to 35 personnel, armed, organized, moving with professional urgency. Holt did a head count of Razor 6. 4 Marines still fully operational. 2 more who could hold a weapon but not move quickly. Cole with his shoulder. Maya. The math was not encouraging. Mercer checked his magazine. 18 rounds. He looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at the approaching dust column. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more clearly. Holt keyed his radio. Static. The repeater station 40 miles north had been silent since the opening of the ambush. Whatever had happened to it, it was not going to help them in the next 15 minutes. Cole said, "Cartel enforcement. That formation is military doctrine. Someone trained these men." "American equipment on the lead vehicle," Whitmore said. "That's an M240. "Range," Holt asked. 1,200 meters. Closing fast." Holt looked at Maya. She was already looking at the approaching vehicles, her eyes moving through the same systematic pattern Cole had watched her use in the motor pool, left to right, near to far, assessing angles and distances with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom the calculation was not a conscious act, but a reflex. She looked at the rifle in the dirt. She picked it up. She moved to the front of the convoy, found a position behind a rock formation on the right side of the canyon entrance, settled into a prone stance. The rock gave her a firing platform at approximately the same elevation as the approaching road, clear sight lines to 800 meters, 2 withdrawal routes if the position became untenable. Cole watched her set up and said quietly to no one in particular, "That is a professionally chosen firing position." Holt said nothing. He positioned his remaining personnel in the defensive layout that took shape in his mind as he moved triangulating fields of fire across the 3 possible approach routes the terrain allowed. The layout was solid, the kind of setup that came from 30 years of thinking about how to defend ground with insufficient resources. But it had a hole, and the hole was at the far end of the approach road where the M240 on the lead truck would establish a base of fire that the carbines could not adequately suppress. Maya's voice flat and technical. "Lead vehicle 950 meters. Machine gunner is standing up in the bed. He's your primary threat." "Holt, can you reach him?" A beat. "Yes." "Take him." She shot the machine gunner at 950 meters through the standing position. The round arriving before the sound did the man dropping into the truck bed before his hands had finished their grip on the weapon. The lead vehicle swerved, slowed, stopped. The convoy behind it compressed and spread as the drivers responded to the sudden loss of their anchor. She worked the bolt. 890 meters, the driver of the second truck exposed through the windshield as the vehicle pulled right. She put the round through the glass, and the truck rolled off the road into a rock outcropping and stopped. The remaining vehicles dismounted fast. Personnel spread into skirmish lines with textbook spacing, using the vehicles for cover, bounding by fire teams, each element covering the movement of the next. It was not the behavior of militia. It was the behavior of trained infantry, adapting to contact in real time, adjusting their approach based on what they were encountering. Cole watched them move. They know what they're doing. "They're adapting," Whitmore said. "They know they have a precision shooter. They're going to try to suppress the position." They did. 3 of the dismounted elements redirected their fire toward Maya's position, laying down high volumes of automatic fire designed to force a shooter off a target even when the rounds were not accurate enough to threaten the shooter directly. It was a sound tactic. Against a precision shooter working from a protected position with both the training and the disposition to stay there regardless of incoming fire, it was considerably less effective. Maya fired 8 times in 4 minutes. 8 times and 8 targets dropped. She did not hurry between shots. Each one followed the same sequence. Assess, calculate, settle, breathe, squeeze. The targets fell in the order she chose them, not the order they presented themselves. The squad leaders first, then the heavy weapon carriers, then the fire team leaders, whose positional authority was visible in the way the others oriented to them. She was not eliminating targets randomly. She was dismantling the unit's command structure from the outside in. Cole watched this and understood what he was watching. He had trained 15 years of snipers, and this was not what basic training looked like. This was not even what advanced training looked like. This was what a decade of deliberate practice under expert instruction looked like when the practitioner was also naturally gifted in the specific ways that long-range shooting demands: the capacity for stillness, the ability to calculate and hold multiple variables simultaneously, the discipline to wait for the right moment, and the nerve to act immediately when it arrived. Then the round hit Maya's left hand. It came from the left flank, a carbine round from one of the dismounted personnel who had worked around the edge of the canyon wall, while the main element suppressed her position. It struck the back of her left hand where it was braced against the forward section of the rifle stock, passed through the soft tissue between the third and fourth metacarpal bones, and exited through the palm. Not fatal, not close to fatal. The hand had no major vessels in that location, no structures whose damage would threaten life. What it had were the small, intricate components of fine motor control, tendons and nerves, the precise mechanical linkages that allow a hand to perform tasks requiring sensitivity and stability at distance. She felt it the way you feel a burn rather than a cut, a sharp, clarifying heat that the brain categorizes before the eyes have confirmed the source. She looked at her hand. The blood was bright against the dirt on her skin. She understood in the way a person understands things. They have the training to understand exactly what the damage meant. Not today, not for the immediate future. But over time, as the tissue healed in the way that a tissue heals when small structures are disrupted, there were certain things this hand would not be able to do that it had been able to do before. The fine adjustments, the precision grip at extreme range, the capacity for the kind of sustained, controlled pressure across great distance that she had been demonstrating for the last 20 minutes. She knew this the way a musician knows what a hand injury means. She reached into her own medical bag, one-handed, pulled field dressing, wrapped the hand with her teeth, and her right hand secured it. She did not tell anyone. She repositioned, chambered around, found the next target. The enemy line was fragmenting. Without command cohesion, without the structural support of the elements she had already removed, the remaining personnel were making individual decisions about how to advance, and individual decisions in a fluid combat environment produce uncoordinated movement that is easier to counter. Holt's 4 effectives had held their ground. The M240 was silent. The convoy was no longer advancing. She had 4 rounds left. She used them on the 4 highest priority remaining targets in order of priority without hesitation. The enemy stopped advancing. They had arrived expecting a crippled convoy with low ammunition and no precision capability. They had found something else, and they were professional enough to recognize the difference and make the calculation that finishing this engagement was going to cost more than the benefit was worth. They began to withdraw. It was not a rout. It was an organized tactical disengagement, vehicles recovering, personnel movement disciplined and covered. They were retreating in the same way they had advanced, with the characteristic behavior of people who had trained together and trusted each other under fire. Cole watched them go. He looked at Maya's bandaged left hand. She had not mentioned it and was not mentioning it now, was already moving back toward the casualty positions with the same systematic efficiency she had moved with since the first shot of the ambush. He set aside what he had seen for later consideration. In the one he had always set things aside that could not be acted on immediately. Filed but not forgotten. Never forgotten. Mercer took the round in his right thigh 11 minutes after the withdrawal began. It came from the tail end of the retreating force, a single shot from a position on the far side of the second vehicle. The kind of shot that happens not because it was planned, but because a retreating soldier turns and fires, and the geometry of the moment puts a round where a round was not expected. Mercer had been moving to check on Reed. The bullet struck the anterior thigh at an angle that intersected the femoral artery, not severing it cleanly, but nicking it in a way that produces the worst possible outcome. Not immediate catastrophic bleeding, but fast progressive blood loss from a wound that looks in the first seconds like it might be manageable and is not. Mercer knew what it was. He had the training to recognize femoral involvement from the color of the blood and the rate it was moving. He pressed both hands to the wound, and his voice when it came out had the specific quality of a man managing fear rather than not feeling it. Doc. Maya was moving before he finished the word. She covered the ground between them in the pattern she had used all day, low and direct and without wasted motion. She reached him, and her hands found the wound in the same instant her knees hit the ground, assessing with touch before sight the way you assess when you cannot afford to wait for visual confirmation. Femoral, nicked, not severed, 90 seconds before blood loss pushed him toward unconsciousness. Maybe 120. She needed a tourniquet high on the thigh, immediately cranked to occlusion pressure and held there. She reached for her medical bag with her left hand and felt for the first time the full cost of the wound she had not told anyone about. The grip was wrong. The bandaged hand would close around the bag, would pull it toward her, but the fine control needed to open the quick-release pocket and extract the tourniquet in the time available was compromised in a way that the adrenaline of the last hour had masked until this precise moment. 2 seconds wasted. 3. Cole's voice came from her left, stripped of everything except what mattered: East Rim. New shooter, 1,150 meters, maybe more. He's got Holt. She looked up. Aldous Holt was standing at the front of Humvee 1, directing the last 2 mobile Marines toward the withdrawal positions, exposed in the way that a man who has been managing a defensive action for 2 hours becomes exposed when he believes the primary threat has been resolved. His back was to the East Rim. He was not scanning above his sight line. The shooter on the East Rim was scanning Holt. Maya calculated the geometry in the time it takes to draw breath. The shooter was elevated East Rim, the light behind him making acquisition difficult from the canyon floor. She read the shadow angle and the apparent size of the position. 1,150 meters. At the outside, 1,160. One-handed from a stationary kneeling position in heat shimmer that had been building for 3 hours against a target that was going to fire in the next several seconds. And Mercer was going to lose consciousness in the next 90. She could not do both. The thought lasted less than a second before something replaced it. Not a decision exactly, something older than decision. A voice from a range in Montana, from a morning when she was 14 years old and complaining about a drill that required too many things at once, and her father had put his hand on her shoulder and said something she had carried for 14 years without knowing she was carrying it. 2 hands, Maya. You've always had 2 hands. Her left hand found the tourniquet by feel closed around it, despite the pain pulled it free from the quick-release pocket. She looped it around Mercer's thigh, the motion awkward and slower than it should have been, the damaged structures in her left palm, reporting damage in terms she understood and acknowledged and set aside. Her right hand reached for the M24. The rifle came to her shoulder in a single movement. Right hand on the grip, no support from the left except the tourniquet loop braced against Mercer's leg, which gave her a point of contact but no real stability. The stock found her cheek. The scope picture appeared. 1,150 meters. Elevated target, wind running east to west at 9 to 11 miles per hour, gusting the kind of variable wind that makes ballistic calculation approximate rather than exact, where you are not solving an equation but making a considered estimate and accepting the uncertainty in it. Kneeling, one hand on the rifle, the left hand occupied with keeping Mercer alive. Her father's voice in the specific register of a technical correction delivered on a cold October morning. Feel the wind, Maya. Don't calculate it. Feel it. She felt it. She made the adjustment in her head, added the elevation correction for the uphill angle, felt the scope settle on the position, despite the single-handed hold found the target in the glass. The shooter on the East Rim had his eye to his own scope. His finger was on the trigger. She breathed. 4 in, hold 7. Her left hand gave the tourniquet windlass a third turn. The resistance increased. Mercer made a sound low in his throat. The bleeding slowed. 8 out. Squeeze. Never pull. Let the shot surprise you. The rifle fired. The recoil drove into her right shoulder without the usual left-hand buffer to distribute it harder than it should have been hard enough that she had to reset her position before she could check the effect. She looked through the scope. The East Rim was empty. The shooter had not completed his trigger pull. Holt was still standing. Maya's left hand gave the windlass 2 more turns. The bleeding stopped. She set the rifle down and used both hands to secure the tourniquet rod, the left hand complying because this was what it was needed for and it was going to do it. Mercer looked up at her. His face was the color of old concrete. His eyes were still present, which meant the tourniquet had done what it needed to do in time. He said, "Did you just—" He stopped. "While you were treating me, you shot." Stop talking, Maya said. Conserve your oxygen. From his position against the third Humvee, Cole had watched the entire sequence. He had watched the left hand take the tourniquet and loop it while the right hand raised the rifle. He had watched the one-handed hold and the one-handed shot, and the way Maya's left hand had continued to work the windlass through the recoil and the aftermath, two tasks operating in parallel with the discipline of long training and the necessity of a moment that admitted no division between them. He had seen many things in 28 years of service. He had not seen this, he said quietly to no particular audience. 15 years training snipers. I have never seen that. The last of the retreating force disappeared around the southern bend of the approach road. The engine sounds faded. The canyon settled into the kind of silence that follows the end of a violent thing, absolute and strange. The silence of a place returning to itself after something has passed through it that did not belong there. The sun was past its peak, angling west, the light in the canyon shifting from the flat vertical hammer of noon toward the longer slanted gold of afternoon. In that light, the rock walls looked almost beautiful layers of time made visible in bands of color, utterly indifferent to the events of the last 2 hours. Mercer lay on the ground with the tourniquet on his thigh, and Maya's hands checking his distal pulse with the same methodical care she had applied to every casualty since the beginning. His color was coming back slowly. The look on his face was one she had not seen on him before, not surprise exactly, not gratitude exactly. Something in the space between those things that had not yet found its name. Cole sat with his back against the third vehicle and his wounded shoulder resting against the cool metal and watched Maya work. The M24 was on the ground beside her. Her left hand was bandage-soaked through still functional in the limited ways she was asking it to be functional. She did not favor it. She did not mention it. He watched her and thought about Nathan Calloway, a man he had trained alongside for 6 weeks in 1989, a man of extraordinary patience and extraordinary precision, who had spoken once at the end of a long day on the range about the daughter he was teaching. Not boasting, Nathan Calloway had not been the kind of man who boasted. He had spoken about it the way a person speaks about something they have been entrusted with, something that carries weight beyond the personal. He said he was teaching her everything. Not just the shooting, the thinking, the patience, the way a situation looks when you have removed the fear from your assessment of it. Cole had not thought about that conversation in years. He thought about it now, watching Nathan Calloway's daughter check Mercer's pulse with her damaged left hand and her steady right in the canyon where she had spent the last 2 hours doing in the specific conditions of a real contact under pressure, everything her father had spent 8 years teaching her to do. She looked up, met his eyes. He said nothing. She returned to Mercer's pulse. In the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of rotors. The sound of rotors grew from suggestion to certainty over the course of 4 minutes. Maya heard it the way she had heard everything in the last 2 hours as information to be filed and acted on in the correct sequence. She finished checking Mercer's distal pulse, noted the strength and regularity, confirmed the tourniquet was holding at occlusion pressure without tissue damage beginning. She moved to read and checked the chest seal she had applied 90 minutes earlier, verified the seal integrity, listened to his breathing with 2 fingers against his sternum rather than a stethoscope she no longer had because the stethoscope had taken a round somewhere around the first hour. Reed breathed. The seal held. She moved on. The medevac came in from the northwest, 2 Blackhawks in loose formation, dropping altitude as they approached the canyon in the specific way that military flight crews approach uncertain landing zones, committing to the descent while keeping options open. They landed in a flat section of canyon floor south of the convoy position, rotors kicking up a wall of dust and grit that reduced visibility to nothing for 15 seconds. When it cleared, the flight medics were already moving. Maya met the lead medic at 20 feet. His name tape said Prescott. He was 30, maybe 32, with the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had done this particular thing many times. He looked at the casualties laid out in order of priority, looked at the bandaging, looked at the tourniquet, timing marks she had written in black marker on Mercer's skin, and looked at Maya. She briefed him without preamble. 6 casualties. Priority 1 is Mercer Corporal right thigh femoral nick tourniquet applied 41 minutes ago. Needs OR in the next 2 hours. Priority 2 is Reed Corporal pneumothorax chest seal intact oxygen and saturation running low. Needs chest decompression en route. Priority 3 is Vance Lance Corporal, shoulder through and through, cleaned and packed stable. Remaining 3 are walking wounded lacerations and 1 possible fracture, none immediately life-threatening. Cole Chief Warrant Officer left, shoulder possible clavicle fracture, arterial involvement, controlled needs imaging, to confirm. Prescott was already directing his partner toward Mercer. He looked at Maya's left hand at the field dressing, soaked through and dark. What about you, Joe? I'm ambulatory. That's not what I asked. I know. She looked at him. Take care of my Marines first. Prescott held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he nodded once and moved to help his partner load Mercer onto the stretcher. Maya stepped back. She watched them work with the trained attention of someone evaluating technique, confirming competence, making sure that what she had done would be continued correctly. Prescott was good. His partner was better. They had Mercer packaged and moving in 3 minutes read and 4. The others in the time after that, a sequence of organized motion that reduced the chaos of the last 2 hours to something manageable and portable. The last stretcher loaded, the rotor's increased pitch, and then there was nothing left to do. Maya sat down. She did not choose to sit. Her legs made the decision, and the rest of her followed, and she found herself on the ground with her back against the front wheel of Humvee 2, the M24 lying in the dirt 3 feet away, the medical bag empty beside her, the canyon walls throwing long afternoon shadows across the ground between her and where her patients had been. Her left hand began to tremble. It was not the small, suppressible tremor of cold or exertion. It was the specific, uncontrollable shake that the body produces when it has been running on adrenaline and discipline for an extended period, and both of those things have finally been given permission to stop. It moved through her left hand and into her wrist, and she watched it the way she might watch weather moving across a landscape, observing something she could not influence, understanding what it meant without needing to name it. She had moved through the entire day with the control of someone who had removed fear from her operational calculus. The fear had been there. It had simply been placed somewhere that did not interfere with the work filed away in the same internal space where she had kept Nathan Calloway's voice and the memory of a cold morning in Montana, and 8 years of a promise she had kept until she couldn't. Now the work was done. The fear came back, not as panic, not as collapse. Just as trembling in one hand in the silence of a canyon in the late afternoon, with no one watching except the rock walls and the sky. She heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The footsteps of a man who has made a decision about where he is going and is in no hurry to arrive, because arriving means saying something, and he is still deciding what that something is. Holt sat down beside her. Not across from her, not at a respectful distance. He sat down next to her with his back against the same wheel close enough that she could hear him breathing the tired, controlled breath of a man who had spent the day holding his unit together by will and had not yet released the tension of that effort. He did not speak immediately. The canyon wind moved through in low, slow pulses. Somewhere above them, a bird was crossing the rim, its shadow tracking across the rock face for a moment before disappearing. Holt looked at his hands. The hands of a man who had spent 30 years in the Marine Corps, scarred and capable, and beginning to show the arithmetic of age in the way the skin lay across the knuckles. He said, I trained alongside your father, Pendleton, 1989. 6 weeks on the range while I was finishing my scout sniper course. He was the range instructor for the advanced session. A pause. He had forgotten more about long-range shooting than I was ever going to learn. Maya did not speak. She was listening in the way she had listened to her father's voice her whole life, with the complete attention of someone for whom these words carried weight that ordinary conversation did not. He talked about you once, end of a long day. We were breaking down the range cleaning weapons. He told me he had a daughter he was teaching. Holt was quiet for a moment. He didn't say it like a man talking about a hobby he shared with his kid. He said it the way men talk about work that matters, about something they're building that's going to last after them. The trembling in Maya's left hand had slowed. She was not sure when that had happened. I didn't make the connection when you showed up at the FOB, Holt said. The name, the file. I had no reason to. He looked at the photograph still in his breast pocket. I should have looked harder. Maya said you couldn't have known. No, a beat. But I told you you'd be a liability. First day, I stood in your medical tent and told you that. You were doing your job. I was wrong. The words came out without inflection, without the softening that apologies usually carry, which made them more honest than an apology would have been. A statement of fact from a man who had decided to say it and was saying it plainly. He stood, brushed the dust from his uniform with 2 passes of his hand. Then he reached over and placed his hand on Maya's shoulder once for the count of 1 full second. Not a gesture for an audience, not a ceremony, just the weight of a hand and what it meant, and then the weight was gone. He walked toward the lead Humvee. Maya watched him go. The trembling in her left hand had stopped. 2 days before Cole arrived at Camp Pendleton, 6 months later, An envelope had come through the base mail system forwarded from FOB Desert Hawk through 3 relay points and slightly battered from the journey. It was addressed in handwriting she recognized from field documentation she had filled out in the canyon. Inside was a card, simple cardstock, the kind sold at any pharmacy near any military installation in the country. In the center printed carefully, Natalie Nathan Calloway Vance, 7 pounds 4 ounces. September 14th. Below it in Vance's handwriting, the letters formed with the deliberate effort of a man who was not accustomed to writing things he needed to get exactly right. She's going to know who you both were. I'll make sure of it. Maya sat with the card for a long time. She thought about her father at a range in Montana, his hand on her shoulder, patient and precise, and entirely present in the way he was present during the things that mattered to him. She thought about the fact that the reach of a life is not always visible from inside that life, that the distance between a man teaching his daughter to shoot and a child being given a name 20-some years later is not a straight line, but it is a line and it holds. She placed the card on her desk next to the photograph of her father. She did not put it away. The flight back to FOB Desert Hawk from the canyon had taken 22 minutes. Maya had spent 19 of them looking out the window at the desert below, which had turned from the flat bleached landscape of midday into something richer and more complicated in the angled light of late afternoon, the rock formations throwing long shadows that made the terrain look like it had depth and meaning it had lacked in the hard light of noon. She thought about her father, not about the shooting, not about the range in Montana or the drills or the technical vocabulary of wind and elevation and trigger discipline that he had built into her over 8 years. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she was not looking at him, the expression she had caught a few times over the years in mirrors and photographs, the expression of a man who was trying to transfer something important from his hands to hers before time ran out. She had not understood at 18 what he was trying to give her. She had understood it today. She looked at her left hand. The field dressing had soaked through completely. The hand itself felt distant, like a piece of equipment attached to her arm that was reporting data from a separate location. She flexed the fingers carefully. They moved all of them in the ranges they should move. But the fine control was already different. Already she could feel the small disruptions in the signal between intention and execution that told her something had been altered in the way the hand worked. Not destroyed, not useless. Changed in the specific way that matters for specific things. She set it aside the way she set aside everything that could not be acted on, immediately, not ignored, not resolved, simply placed where it would wait until there was time for it. There would be time. There was always time for the things you survived long enough to address. Fort Huachuca was 40 miles north of the FOB, and Colonel Marcus Webb's office was on the second floor of the administrative building that overlooked the parade ground. He had been in that office for 3 years, and the walls reflected a career of 30 years that had taken him from Beirut to Baghdad to the kind of senior command position where the battles were fought in language rather than terrain. He was 61 years old. He had the particular stillness of men who have seen enough that very little surprises them anymore, and who have learned in that stillness to pay close attention to the things that do. Maya's file was on his desk. He had read it twice before she arrived. The official record was clean and consistent, with the picture of a competent, quietly distinguished Navy corpsman who had served 3 years without incident and beyond the ordinary excellence of her evaluations. It was the file of someone who had decided very deliberately what they wanted the file to say. Maya stood at attention in front of his desk. Her left hand was properly bandaged white and clean against her uniform. Her face was composed and direct, the face of someone who has decided that what other people see of her is a choice she makes rather than a condition she exists in. Webb looked at her for a moment. Your service record is exemplary. It also fails to mention that your father was Gunnery Sergeant Nathan Calloway, USMC Scout, sniper instructor. Fails to mention the Montana State Championship at 1200 meters. He turned to the second page of a document she had not seen before. And it fails to mention that at age 17 you were enrolled in a classified advanced marksmanship program at Quantico, Tier 1 designation. 2 months into that program your father died, you withdrew. Every record of your enrollment was sealed at your request. Maya said, yes, sir. Webb set the document down. We are prepared to offer you immediate transfer to Scout Sniper School, not as a student, as an instructor. Respectfully declined, sir. He stopped. I'm a corpsman, sir. That's what I choose to be. She said it without edge, without defensiveness, with the simple certainty of someone whose preference has been examined from every angle and found to hold. Taking lives is something I'll do when the alternative is watching good people die. but it's not who I am. The room was quiet for a moment. Webb picked up a separate document. Older paper slightly yellowed bearing a classification designation that had been declassified 18 months earlier as part of a routine records review. We also pulled your father's final debrief, his last formal communication before the training accident. Webb looked at the page. He was asked about his long-term goals for his daughter's development. His exact words were, "Whatever happens, make sure Maya protects people. That's all that matters. Not the scores, not the records, not what she can do at distance. The protecting." Maya did not move. "Your mother asked you to never pick up a weapon. I understand why she asked that." Webb looked at her steadily. "But your father never asked that. He asked you to protect people, however you could, in whatever form that took. The promise you have been keeping for 8 years was never his promise. It was your mother's grief, and your father's actual wish." He paused and let the sentence finish itself in the silence. Maya looked at the document on his desk. At her father's words in the careful, neutral language of a formal debrief, saying the thing he had never said to her directly because there had not been time. Because there had been a clear morning at Pendleton and 60 feet of air and no time left for the things that had not yet been said. She looked at it for a long moment. Webb said, "Dismissed, Corman." She saluted, turned to leave. "Calloway." She stopped. "He knew what he was building," Webb said quietly. "What he built protected people yesterday. Several of them will go home to their families because of it." She walked out into the afternoon. Her mother called 3 days later. Maya was sitting in the small room she occupied at the FOB, her left hand in the exercises the base physician had prescribed, slow flexion and extension of each finger in sequence, the kind of repetitive, unglamorous work that physical recovery actually consists of. The hand complied imperfectly, each movement slightly delayed from the intention behind it, the signal arriving at its destination a fraction of a second late, like a voice on a phone call with a long connection. She answered on the second ring. Her mother's voice was the voice of a woman who had spent a week finding the right way to say something and had finally decided that the right way was directly. "I've been reading about what happened, the official reports, the letters from the families." A pause. "I called Sergeant Holt's office. He told me what you did." Maya said nothing. "I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." Her mother's voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who has been through the worst thing possible and found on the other side of survival a kind of clarity. "Your father's last words to me, the morning before he went to the range. Not his last words in general. His last words to me specifically before he left the house." She paused. "He said, 'Let her be what she's meant to be.' I was making him coffee and he said it out of nowhere, the way he said things when he'd been thinking about something for a long time and finally decided to say it. 'Let her be what she's meant to be.'" Maya was very still. "I told myself for 8 years that what I asked of you at his grave was what he would have wanted. I was wrong. I was protecting myself from losing you the same way I lost him. And I made you carry that." A breath. "You weren't breaking a promise in that canyon, Maya. You were keeping one. His." They talked for 20 minutes, not about the canyon, not about the hand, not about any of the things that had happened in the last week. They talked about ordinary things, the things that families talk about, the texture of continuing to live alongside each other across distance. It was not a healing, exactly. It was the beginning of a healing, which is a different thing, slower and less dramatic and more real. When they hung up, Maya sat for a while in the quiet room. Then she returned to the physical therapy exercises, and she did them twice as many times as she had been told to because this was the work, and the work was what came next. 6 months later, CWO Brennan Cole appeared at the entrance to the Camp Pendleton training facility on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. He had retired from active service 8 weeks earlier. He looked the same as he had in the canyon, which is to say he looked like a man who had decided that the years he carried were not a burden to be managed, but a condition to be inhabited. His knee gave him trouble in the mornings. He had stopped pretending otherwise. He was carrying a case. Maya met him outside the classroom building. Through the window behind her, 18 Navy corpsmen were visible at their desks reviewing the previous session's material on simultaneous task performance. The curriculum was 8 weeks old. 4 other bases were running versions of it. The after-action documentation from Razor 6 had provided the institutional argument. Maya had provided the content built from the foundation her father had laid and the 8 years of medical training she had placed on top of it. Cole set the case on the low wall between them and opened it. Inside was a spotting scope. Military-grade 15 power, the kind used by designated marksmen and their spotters to read wind and confirm impacts at distance. It was well used, the finish worn to bare metal at the contact points, the kind of equipment that had been used seriously for a long time by someone who knew what they were doing with it. This was mine, Cole said. 15 years. I looked through it at more targets than I can count. He looked at it for a moment. I don't have a use for it anymore. My eyes aren't what they were, and my knee keeps me off any terrain where it would matter. He looked at Maya. Your father trained me to see things at distance. Not just the target, the whole picture. Wind flags, mirage, the way the air moves in front of a shot. He paused. He was better at it than I was. You're better at it than he was. Maya looked at the scope. I can't take this. You already did, Cole said. 6 months ago in a canyon, I'm just catching up with the paperwork. He closed the case and left it on the wall. He shook her right hand because he had noticed what most people still had not noticed about her left. And he was not a man who drew attention to things that people had chosen not to make a subject of conversation. Then he walked back across the base toward the parking lot, his knee working in its imperfect way, the afternoon light long and golden on the concrete. Corporal Garrett Mercer arrived the following Thursday. He walked without a limp, which was something the surgeons had told him in July was the realistic best outcome, and which he had achieved through the specific combination of physical therapy, stubbornness, and the refusal to accept probability that had characterized him since before Maya had met him. He was wearing civilian clothes, which made him look younger, or perhaps just different, without the structure of the uniform to organize the impression he made. He was carrying something in brown paper, flat and rectangular. He handed it to her without preamble. Inside the paper was a framed piece of fabric, approximately 8 inches by 8 inches, the unit patch of Recon Team Razor 6 mounted and sealed behind glass. The standard patch had been modified. The design elements were the same, but overlaid in the center was a medical cross in red, and over that, in a contrasting dark color, the crosshairs of a rifle scope. The two images occupied the same space without canceling each other out. Along the bottom in the font, the unit had used for their official documentation, Razor 6 Actual. Below that smaller, what do we know? Mercer looked at the patch, then at Maya. Team voted, unanimous. He paused. You were always one of us. The paper just needed to catch up. Maya looked at the patch. She looked at the medical cross and the crosshairs sharing the same center point, and thought about what it had taken to understand that they could share a center point, that they were not opposing forces to be chosen between, but two expressions of the same thing, the same fundamental orientation toward what happens to people in the worst moments of their lives. Mercer, she said, yeah. When you told me I was going to slow you down, first morning, in the motor pool. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. Yeah, you weren't the only one who thought it. I was the loudest. You were the loudest. She looked at the patch. You also covered me for 6 hours while I worked. Every time I was exposed. Every time I told you to cover me better. A pause. You did. He said nothing for a moment. Thank you for this, she said. He nodded once in the way that men nod when they have said what they came to say, and the conversation has done what it needed to do. Then he walked back down the path toward the gate, hands in his pockets, the afternoon light, the same gold it had been when Cole left 2 days earlier. The shooting range at Camp Pendleton was empty at 1700 hours on a Friday in early November. Maya had signed out a lane for an hour. She had brought the M24 assigned to her through the ICMP program, a different rifle from the one in the canyon, though the same model and the same weight and the same balance point that her hands knew without consulting the conscious mind. She set up at the 500-meter line. Her left hand held the forward section of the stock in the way the physical therapist had recommended, the grip modified from her pre-injury technique to account for the reduced fine control, distributing the support differently along the palm. It was not the hold she had used at 17. It was the hold that worked now in this hand with the function this hand currently had. She breathed, found the target, shot. The impact was 3 inches left of center. Adjustment, shot again, center. She moved the target to 700 meters and repeated the sequence. Then 800. At 800 meters, the modified grip produced groups that would have satisfied the standards of most military precision shooting programs. They were not the groups she had produced in the canyon under pressure, and they were not the groups she had produced at 18 in the last weeks before her father died. They were what she could do now with the hand she currently had through the work of learning to shoot again from the beginning with the changed geometry of a changed hand. 800 meters was not 1150. It was not the 1,200 meters of the girl in the photograph, and it was not the 1,287 meters of the young woman she had been 2 months before her father died. It was 800 meters clean and consistent, achieved by a 28-year-old woman who had spent 6 months relearning a skill that had been partially taken from her and building it back into something functional and real. It was enough. She lowered the rifle, stood, packed the case with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything: the spotting scope first, then the rifle, then the ammunition, each item in its place. She picked up the medical bag from the bench beside her. Through the window of the classroom building across the base, the lights were on. 18 corpsmen waiting for the final session of the week, some of them looking out the window at the range, the way students look out windows when they are not quite ready to be done with what they have been learning and want a little more time with it before the day ends. She walked toward them, the bag in her left hand, the rifle case in her right, the weight of both distributed evenly, neither pulling her off balance, neither competing with the other for the attention of the body carrying them. Through the glass panel beside the classroom door, she could see 18 faces: corpsmen with their training binders open, waiting for the session to begin. Young faces, the kind of faces that still believed the worst thing that could happen to them was failing a test. She was going to teach them otherwise, not by telling them, but by showing them what it looked like when training and necessity and the weight of everything you carry from the people who shaped you all arrive at the same moment and you find out whether it holds. She had found out. It held. She pushed the door open and went in.